Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I join the Prime Minister in wishing Her Majesty and Prince Philip a very happy platinum wedding anniversary. Mr. Speaker, the thoughts of the whole House will be with the victims of the devastating earthquake that hit Iran and Iraq on Monday, leaving hundreds dead and thousands without shelter. I hope the government is offering all necessary emergency help and support that can be used to save life. I also hope, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure the House will, join me in sending our deepest sympathies to the family and friends of the late Carl Sargent, the Labour Assembly member in Wales, who very tragically died last week. Mr. Speaker, crime is up, violent crime is up, and police numbers are down by 20,000. Will the Prime Minister urge her Chancellor, who I note this week is sitting absolutely next to her, so it'll be easy for her to make this demand on him, to provide the funding our police need to make communities safe?
Prime Minister.
Well, first of all, can I say to the Right Honourable, he raised 3 points there. First of all, on the earthquake that took place in Iraq and Iran, we are monitoring this closely. It's a devastating earthquake. We know our thoughts are with all those who've been affected by it. We're looking at the situation. We do stand ready to provide assistance for urgent humanitarian needs if requested. So the government will do what is necessary, and we will stand ready to help people. I also join with him in offering condolences to the family and friends of Carl Sargent. And I'm sure that goes for everybody across this whole House. Now, he raised the issue of crime and policing. In fact, crimes traditionally measured by the Independent Crime Survey are down by well over a third since 2010. We have been protecting police budgets. We've protected police budgets. And we're putting more money into counter-terrorism policing. But what matters is what the police do and how they deliver. And as I say, the crime survey shows that crime is down by nearly a third since 2010.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, I've been following some of the tweets from some of her friends along the front bench over there. And one of them, and I quote, says, "Very disappointed and mystified at the closure of Uxbridge Police Station." Just for the want of any doubt, Mr. Speaker, that came from the Foreign Secretary, who is also
To hear about the Uxbridge Police Station. Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, I'm very pleased you do, Mr. Speaker, because the Foreign Secretary is so excited he won't even hear the answer. The real reason, Mr. Speaker, is that it's closing because of a £2.3 billion cut for police budgets in the last Parliament, and it gets worse. They're going to be cut by another £700 million by 2020. Mr. Speaker, under this government, there are 11,000 fewer firefighters in England since 2010. And last year, deaths in fires increased by 20%. In the wake of the terrible Grenfell Tower fire, the Prime Minister was actually very clear that she said this could not be allowed to happen again and money would be no object to fire safety. Will she therefore now back the campaign to provide £1 billion to local councils to retrofit sprinklers in all high-rise blocks?
Prime Minister.
Well, first of all, on the first question that the Right Honourable Gentleman raised, the first issue that he raised, he might not have noticed, but the Police and Crime Commissioner in London is the Mayor. The last time I looked, Sadiq Khan was a Labour Mayor of London. Although perhaps the leader of the Labour Party thinks he's not Labour enough for him and his brand of Labour. But let's be very clear. Let's be very clear about funding for the Metropolitan Police. There's more money and more officers for each Londoner than anywhere else in the country. That's the reality about funding for the Metropolitan Police. Now, he has asked about the issue of fire, and we absolutely take what happened, the appalling tragedy of what happened at Grenfell Tower, seriously, and that's why I set up the public inquiry. It's why my right honourable friend, the Communities Secretary, has set up already in work taking place on the fire regulations and the building regulations to ensure that we do have those right. And it's why we continue to support Kensington and Chelsea Council in ensuring that we deliver for those who have been victims of this awful tragedy. But he asks about sprinklers. And of course, we do want to make sure that homes are fit for those who live in them. There is a responsibility on building owners in relation to that, and some owners do retrofit sprinklers, but there are other safety measures that can take place. But perhaps he ought to look at what Labour councils have said about this. Haringey Council rejected calls to fit sprinklers, saying what matters is introducing the right safety measures. Lewisham Council say they need to weigh up the issues, because fitting sprinklers can involve cutting through fire compartmentalisation, which is another safety measure. Lambeth Council said there were issues retrofitting sprinklers and questions about how effective they were. Even Islington Council say they need to look at how effective sprinklers would be.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, the coroner after Lacknell House thought that fitting sprinklers would be a right thing to do. The chief fire officer thinks it's a right thing to do. Those local authorities that have asked central government for support to retrofit sprinklers have all been refused by her government. Surely we need to think about the safety of the people living in socially rented high-rise blocks. Yesterday I was passed a letter, Mr. Speaker, from a lettings agency in Lincolnshire, where universal credit is about to be rolled out. The agency, and I have the letter here, the agency is issuing all of its tenants with a preemptive notice of eviction because universal credit has driven up arrears where it's been rolled out. And the letter, and I quote, says, and I quote, GAP property cannot sustain arrears at the potential levels universal credit could create. Will the Prime Minister pause universal credit so it can be fixed? Or does she think it is right to put thousands of families through Christmas in the trauma of knowing they're about to be evicted because they're in rent arrears because of universal credit?
Prime Minister.
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman that there have been concerns raised, in this House previously over the issue of people managing their budgets to pay rent. But what we actually see, is that after 4 months, the number of people on universal credit in arrears has fallen by a third. Now, it's important that we do look at the issues on this particular case. Now, the right honourable gentleman might like to send the letter through. I know in an earlier Prime Minister's questions, he raised a specific specific case of an individual who'd written to him about her experience on universal credit. I think it was Georgina. As far as I'm aware, he has so far not sent that letter to me, despite the fact that
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, I am very happy to give the Prime Minister a copy of this letter. I suspect it's not the only letting agency that's sending out that kind of letter. She might be aware that food bank usage has increased by 30% in areas where universal credit has been rolled out. 3 million families are losing an average of $2,500 a year through universal credit. The Child Poverty Action Group estimates more than 1 million will be in poverty due to cuts imposed by universal credit. If those aren't reasons enough to pause the rollout, I don't know what there are. And, Mr. Speaker, last week, the Chief Executive...
Order. Mr. Morris, calm yourself. Behave with restraint. You're seated in a prominent position. Quiet. It will be good for your well-being. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Chief Executive of NHS England, Simon Stevens, wrote, "The budget for the NHS next year is well short of what is currently needed. A&E waiting time target hasn't been met for 2 years. The 62-day cancer waiting time target hasn't been met since 2015. So again, can the Prime Minister spend the next week ensuring that the budget does give sufficient funding to our NHS to meet our people's needs?"
The Prime Minister.
First of all, on the first issue that the right honourable gentleman raised, can I remind him yet again, universal credit is ensuring that we are seeing more people in work and able to keep what they earn. He talks about what Simon Stevens says about the National Health Service. Yes, let's look at what Simon Stevens says about the National Health Service. The quality of NHS care is demonstrably improving. Outcomes of care for most major conditions are dramatically better than 3 or 5 or 10 years ago. He said, what's been achieved in England over the past 3 years? More convenient access to primary care services, first steps to expand the primary care workforce, highest cancer survival rates ever, big expansion in cancer check-up, public satisfaction with hospital inpatients at its highest for more than 2 decades. That's the good news of our National Health Service.
Well, it's very strange, Mr. Speaker, that the Chief Executive of NHS providers says we're in the middle of the longest and deepest financial squeeze in history. I've got a pretty good idea they know what they're talking about. Let me give the Prime Minister another statistic. The number of people waiting more than 4 hours in A&E has gone up by 557% since 2010. 2 weeks ago, Mr. Speaker, the opposition to us, the Tories over there, were very noisy when I mentioned you are the government, we're the opposition, you're in opposition to us. It's not complicated. It's not complicated. But if I...
the opposition sooner where you're going.
2 weeks ago, Mr. Speaker, I raised the question of cuts in school budgets. Teachers and parents telling MPs what the reality of it was about. The Prime Minister was in denial. Every Tory MP was in denial. This week, 5,000 head teachers from 25 counties wrote to the Chancellor saying, we are simply asking for the money that is being taken out of the system to be returned. Will the Prime Minister listen to head teachers and give a commitment that the budget next week will return the money to school budgets so that our schools are properly funded?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I say to the right honourable gentleman, actually I think this is a major moment. He has got something right today. We are the government and he is the opposition. And on the NHS, there are 1,800 more patients seen within the 4-hour A&E standard every single day compared to 2010. And he talks about school funding. We are putting more money into our school budget. We are seeing record levels of funding going into our schools. And this government is the first government in decades that has actually gripped the issue of a fairer national funding formula. And we are putting that into practice. But you can only put record levels of money into your NHS and your schools with a strong economy. And what do we see? What do we see as the result of policies that this Conservative government has put into place? Income inequality, down under the Conservatives, up under Labour. Unemployment, down under the Conservatives, up under Labour. Workless households, down under the Conservatives, up under Labour. deficit down under the Conservatives, up under Labour. He's planning a run on the pound. We're building a Britain fit for the future.
Mr. Speaker, I would have thought that 5,000 head teachers would have a pretty good idea about the funding problems of their schools and a pretty good idea of the effect of government cuts on school budgets, on their staff and on their students. Indeed, the IFS says that school funding will have fallen by 5% in real terms by 2019 as a result of government policies. Mr. Speaker, public services in crisis, from police to the fire service, from NHS to children's schools, while a super-rich few dodge their taxes. Ah, yes. The government sits on its hands as billions are lost to vital public services. The Conservatives cut taxes for the few and vital services for the many. It's not just that there's one rule for the super-rich.
Order. I apologise for interrupting the right honourable gentleman. Both sides of this House will be heard. And the idea that when somebody's asking a question, there should be a concerted attempt to shout that person down is totally undemocratic and completely unacceptable from whichever quarter it comes. And I would just ask colleagues to give some thought to how our behaviour is regarded by the people who put us here. Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, quite simply, isn't the truth that this is a government that protects the super-rich while the rest of us pick up the bill through cuts, austerity, poverty, homelessness, low wages and slashing of local services all over the country? That is the reality of a Tory government.
Prime Minister.
We have taken £160 billion extra in as a result of the action we've taken on tax avoidance and evasion. The tax gap is now at its lowest level ever. If the tax gap had stayed at the level it was under the Labour Party, we would be losing the equivalent of the entire police budget for England and Wales. We, in the Conservatives, are building a Britain that's fit for the future. The best Brexit deal, more high-paid jobs, better schools, the homes our country needs. Labour have backtracked on Brexit. They've gone back on their promise on student debt, and they would cause and lose control of public finances. I say to the right honourable gentleman, he may have given momentum to his party, but he brings stagnation to the country.